Good morning and thank you for joining us on what is, of course, just another quiet Monday morning from a news perspective. Well, it's a brilliant day first and foremost because millions of school children finally are going back to school, and parents up and down the country will, of course, be breathing a massive sigh of relief. Now, before I get into the main part of the speech, I feel I must just comment on the interview overnight from the States, where I've just got two simple things to say. I actually think it's a tragedy that private family conversations are aired in public. It's just a breach of trust. And secondly, given the Queen and the royal family's duty to the Commonwealth of 2 billion people from all ethnicities and faiths, I really do find the inference of racism being present just totally unbelievable. But this press conference is about Reform UK and its future, and I want to start by hearing a message from Nigel.
The smartest thing I ever did in politics was to launch the Brexit Party, because it looked like Brexit was lost. It was a spectacular success. In the space of a few weeks, over 5 million votes and 50% more votes than any other party that contested those European elections in May of 2019. And throughout that campaign and thereafter, we campaigned under the slogan of change politics for good, because we always thought Brexit was the first step to modernising Britain. Now, for me, Brexit being completed, albeit not perfectly, but being completed, marks the end of nearly 30 years of standing in elections and leading political parties. So I've decided I've achieved my goals, and whilst I support everything that the Reform UK Party stands for, and in particular, updating a 19th century set of institutions into the 21st century, it's now time for somebody else to take the lead. And that is what Richard Tice is doing, who, after all, stood by me through the Brexit Party all the way through that difficult period. In the end, I suppose, if it hadn't been for us, I don't think Boris Johnson would even be Prime Minister. But there's no reforming zeal with Johnson's government. In fact, I wonder whether we can even call it a Conservative party, given the way that it's acting. It's more like the Greens. The Labour opposition, too, haven't worked out what they really stand for. Well, Richard today, as the new leader of Reform UK, is launching a bold, new tax initiative. I like it, and I wish Richard well in what is not going to be an easy job, but he knows that.
Well, thank you, Nigel. And firstly, I want to thank Nigel and pay tribute to his enormous contribution to our country. For over 2 decades, he played the longest, the most critical role in securing our exit from the European Union. There's no question, without his efforts, there would have been no referendum at all. And it was a real privilege to me to have helped him over the last couple of years to ensure that we left the EU. And it's a great honour that he's asked me to lead Reform UK into the future, and I know that I can count on his wise counsel, wisdom and advice going forwards in his role as Honorary President. And we must look forwards now from the horrendous 12 months that we've just endured. Reform UK is ambitious. Our country can indeed have a great future. But to achieve this goal, we are absolutely clear that the country needs real reform. And reform must happen in crucial areas. It's desperately needed so that our country is much better run, it's better managed, and it works for the people, not just the establishment and their friends. I'm talking about no-nonsense, common sense reform. Action, not words, deeds, not waffle. I believe that reform is needed in 3 crucial areas. Firstly, we must reform the way that our economy is taxed and run. We must be ambitious in seeking a high-growth, low-tax, smartly regulated, not daftly regulated economy. This is the only way to securing better wages and generating more money to invest in healthcare and other public services. Secondly, we must reform the way our public services are managed and run. They must work faster and more efficiently for us, the people their customers. And thirdly, we must reform the institutions that control and govern us. So again, they work fairly for the people, not just the elite that run them. The unelected cronyism of the House of Lords, the wasteful, bloated BBC, the unaccountable civil service, the Electoral Commission, our voting system, which perpetuates a two-party system that reduces choice and reduces the opportunity for change. But today, I'm going to focus on our economy, which is fundamental to our potential as a nation. We'll then be producing in due course other bold plans for the reform of health and social care, our savings and pensions, amongst others. Because post-Brexit, the whole point of it is we have a huge opportunity to truly become a high-growth, low-tax economy, creating better wages for the least well-off, the lowest paid, whilst giving us more money, more tax revenues to invest in better healthcare. But this government, this Tory government, has completely abandoned this ambition in last week's budget. They favour another decade of Tory austerity Mark II. Their track record and their future plan, unbelievably, it involves the highest tax take for some 70 years, the lowest growth for some 60 years, and more regulation from nanny state. I now call them not the Tory party, not the Conservative Party, they are now the con socialists. Unbelievably, they want to drag another 1.3 million people of the lowest paid into paying income tax, even if they're earning less than 50% of the average national salary. This is literally morally indefensible. The Tories are now confirmed as the party of high tax, high regulation and low growth. And Reform UK is now the only party of low tax and high growth to give better wages. And our bold economic vision is centred around the lowest paid, the self-employed who've been ignored and abandoned by this government, small businesses, the wealth creators, the entrepreneurs. These are the people who will drive our country's future prosperity. And I've got a series of slides that sets out the detail of our vision and our economic stimulus. And the simple summary is you create faster growth by cutting and simplifying taxes, by cutting unnecessary regulation, and by cutting the mountain of wasteful government spending. Today I'm going to focus on cutting and simplifying taxes, and other proposals will follow on reforming savings, regulation and government waste. And next, we're going to look at the record of the UK's growth in the last 6-7 decades. And you can see clearly that growth has been declining relentlessly, decade after decade, over the last 6 decades, from where it was in the 1960s. And this really matters. If the UK matched our growth in the 1980s over a normal 5-year period, we'd have an extra £35 billion every year of tax revenues to invest in public services. If we grew at the 1960s rate of 3.5% every year, then that would be an extra 60 billion plus every year. This is really, really significant. So we must raise our sights. We can do this. There's no good reason why it cannot be achieved. But the solution is we have to grow the cake, not complicate it, not regulate it, and not overtax it. And next, we can see the impact of becoming now what the UK is, which is a high tax, low growth economy. This shows the total tax take, this graph, over the last 70 years of the UK. And you can clearly see now the Chancellor's plan is to take 35% of the size of our whole economy every year by way of taxes. And this is just unacceptable, largely by stealth. Taxes have been steadily rising over the last 25 years, relentlessly, to the highest now for well over 50 years. And the Chancellor's gloomy, unambitious growth projection is that we would just grow at 1.6, 1.7%. That is woeful. That is disastrous for this country. It's growth, not taxes, that generates more money for public services. Now, our economic performance during COVID has been one of the worst in the world. And over the last decade, the Tory government's track record, they have presided over a net 400 plus tax rises, increasing regulation and, as clearly shown before, declining growth. And that is no way. So if we look next on this slide, you can look at I want to look at our tax system, which is complex and which stifles growth. We have, unbelievably, the longest tax code in the world. It's give or take 20,000 pages. It's so long, even HMRC don't know to the nearest 1,000 pages how long it is. What I can tell you is that it's about 5 times longer than all of Harry Potter books combined, and a lot less fun and interesting. It's about 66 times longer than the most efficient tax code in the world, which is the high-growth, low-tax economy of Hong Kong, who've got a tax code of around 300 pages. Ours has grown threefold since the late 1990s. It's not stable, it's not predictable, it's not designed to promote growth, it's not designed to help the wealth creators, the entrepreneurs, the self-employed, the SMEs. So next, as we look at, this is the really, really important slide, because on this slide shows, in this graph, the blue columns show the total percentage national debt as a percentage of the overall size of our economy, of our GDP. And most people wouldn't know that for over 30 years, between the two world wars, a moment of national crisis, we had debt to GDP of over 150% for 30 plus years. And then, in the high growth decades, it came tumbling right down. Now, this red line shows the interest rates over the last 120 years. And when we had the high debt of over 150%, interest rates were relatively low. But then let's move right over to the right-hand side, and you see these columns here, and where the red line is now. Interest rates are absolutely on the floor. And then the yellow columns, that's the Office of Budget's Responsibilities forecast, based on the Chancellor's plans, of where our debt to GDP will be. Now, our stimulus and simplification package, you may just be able to see, is relatively modest, just the small green boxes. But at the moment, there is no national debate amongst politicians, amongst the mainstream media, as to actually what level of debt our country, our economy can afford. And this is really important. The con-socialists, they seem to think that we've got to repay this national debt immediately. This is completely wrong. Nations don't have to repay sovereign debt. You have to be able to show that you've got a credible plan so that you can refinance debt. You can roll it forward. And isn't it interesting? Successful, low-tax, high-growth economies like the US, they have debt 20% higher, give or take, than the UK's as a percentage of the size of their economy. Singapore, hugely fast-growing economy, their debt is some 30% higher than the UK's. Now, we've got a real opportunity, because at the moment, the Bank of England, they own actually, and the Bank of England, of course, is part of the state, they actually own internally over 40% of all our national debt. Some people have called it the magic money tree. Well, we have an opportunity to turn it into what I call the smart money mountain. Because what we can do, rather than that debt being held by the Bank of England in short-term gilts, the Bank of England could refinance all of it internally, still held only by the Bank of England, as a long-term 75-year corona bond, a bit like a war bond. And if you fix the rate of interest at just half of 1%, then actually you deal with what the credit markets focus on. We remove the refinance risk, we dramatically reduce the interest rate risk, and therefore that shows that actually we can invest. We can invest in being a low-tax, high-growth economy. We can afford these higher debt levels in order to become a high-growth economy. And this is so important, and it's so disappointing that politicians and the mainstream media are totally focused on the wrong big issue. So next, I'm going to look at our relative growth over the last 15 years Here we are, the red column on the right. Yes, great, we've beaten the euro area. But compared to Australia, our growth has been woeful. We're about 25% behind Australia, a whole different league behind Singapore. And this really, really matters. If we had grown at the same rate as Australia in the last 15 years, our tax revenues every single year would be £150 billion approximately higher than they are at the moment. That's like a whole nother NHS budget. Just imagine that. That is the power of compound, consistent growth. It's really important. It matters. So next, we're going to look at our simplification, our stimulus, because what we're absolutely clear on is that low tax, simple tax, creates faster growth. And our stimulus plan amounts to some £48 billion per annum, just over 2% of GDP. Some might say that's actually modest compared to what they're doing in the US, which is a one-off stimulus of some 10% of their economy. But our annual stimulus plan, we're going to free up over 6 million people from paying income tax by lifting the threshold to £20,000 from £12,500. That's 20%, 1 in 5 of taxpayers, and the rate would stay at 20%. So compare that to what the Chancellor wants to do. He wants to drag in over 1 million people of the lowest paid, the least well off, into paying income tax. Reform UK, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to free up 6 million people. Interestingly, for nurses, very topical at the moment, under our plan, nurses' net take-home pay would increase by some 6% as opposed to the government's plan. So hopefully the nurses and nursing unions will recognise the benefits of this plan. And it's the least well off who benefit proportionately the most. They'll be saving almost £30 a week to help with paying rent, utilities, food bills, mortgages. That would be really meaningful. They would lift the higher rate tax threshold to £70,000 from £50,000. And there'd be a flat 40% tax rate above that. Would lift the capital gains tax threshold, again, to £20,000, with a single 20% tax rate above. So you can see we're very much focused on the number 20. We're simplifying things, keeping things simple. We'd free up around 1.2 million small businesses and self-employed from paying corporation tax. That, by the way, that's over 80% of all companies, because we would lift the minimum threshold from £0 to £100,000 and would raise the corporation tax rate thereafter from 19 to 20%. And then we'd cut employers' national insurance from 13.8% to 10% under £70,000. So these plans will stimulate a significant increase in jobs, make it much easier for businesses, particularly small businesses, the self-employed, to invest in equipment, in software, in new designs, in more jobs, rather than paying money to the taxman. So that's the core stimulus. And then and we believe with this stimulus and the simplification, that'll generate an extra 1.25% growth every single year. Less tax, simpler tax. And next, I'm going to talk about the simplification. And this plan shows we're going to reduce and simplify residential stamp duty. There'll be no stamp duty below £750,000. That will massively stimulate economic activity and construction, and we'll tier it above that level. We'll abolish stamp duty on share trading, which is the subject of huge avoidance, and this will enable the city to compete globally. And the city's competition, let's be clear, it's not Frankfurt, it's not Paris, it's not Amsterdam. It is Asia and it is New York. So we've got to help the city compete on the global stage. We'd abolish VAT on domestic fuel. Again, that'll help the least well off the most. We'll abolish air passenger duty to help the devastated travel sector. We'll abolish the burdensome apprenticeship levy, which ironically actually served to reduce apprentice numbers in the beginning. We'd abolish business rates for small and medium-sized firms and offset that with an online delivery tax at 3%, which will create a much fairer, more level playing field for high street businesses, physical businesses, against online businesses. We'd abolish inheritance tax for all estates under £2 million and have a simple 20% rate above that. The truth is, inheritance tax, not only is it probably the most hated tax, it's a form of double taxation, but there's an army of accountants that's trying to find ways to avoid it. I want to redeploy that army into creating, making, designing things rather than dull tax avoidance. Then I want to provide 100% capital allowances on corporate investment in year one. And finally, we'd reform the complicated savings and pension system that benefits those currently with the most to save and is least fair for those with the least to save, the lowest paid, the lowest earners. It disproportionately favours the wealthy middle class. We'll be coming up with some detailed proposals on it. But in summary, what we'll do is move tax relief from on the way in to actually when you draw down savings. That will be much fairer across society and particularly for the lowest paid. So next, we've got a slide here which is in the detailed presentation you can find on the website, setting out line by line the impact financially of each of these items. I'm not going to go through that now, but it is there on the website for you to look in detail. And then next, I'm looking at this graph will show the stimulus impact of this extra growth every single year of, we believe, 1.25%. The red columns show how the extra tax revenues grow over a decade based on that extra growth relative to the blue columns being the cost. And that means that by 2030, tax revenues will be well over an additional £50 billion a year. If you couple that with a relentless, ongoing simplification of taxes and regulations, we will continue to generate growth. And frankly, we just need to scrap the existing tax code, rewrite it, set ourselves a maximum of 500 pages, because it changed the mindset. It'll force us to think, actually, what do we really need? Why is that there? Is it necessary? How do we simplify it? How do we make ourselves more productive? We always hear this complaint that we're less productive. Well, this is one of the reasons. The complexity of our tax system and our economy, we have to simplify it. But the Tory and the Labour Party, they've essentially merged now. Their economic philosophy is exactly the same. Higher tax, higher regulations, lower growth. And it would be a disaster. So next, in conclusion, I think I've shown that growth is absolutely key, but it's been declining here in the UK. We are now a high-tax, high-regulation, low-growth economy after a decade of Tory rule. And it matters because if actually investors and talented people, if they see us as a high-tax economy, then they're not going to invest here. They're not going to come here. And heaven forbid, people here, capital here, may leave the country. Talented people may leave the country. This would be an absolute disaster. This is the threat that we face. But our plans would free up again over 6 million people from paying income tax, and including the example of nurses who would be some 6% better off in net take-home pay. Would free up about 1.2 million firms from paying corporation tax. That's going to help the self-employed who've been excluded by this government, small businesses, more growth, more jobs, more investment. We abolish this raft of complex, stifling taxes. And in summary, higher growth every year means better wages, especially for the lowest paid, and higher growth means more tax revenues, which means you can increase your spend on crucial public services, healthcare, social care, and others. So there is a genuine win-win potential from this economic vision, the cornerstone for Reform UK. Low tax, high growth, better wages. That's the message we're going to be taking to voters. And this is crucial as we build over the next 3 years to the general election. Now, in the coming days, we'll be announcing candidates for the elections that hopefully are still going to be held in May. And this will be very much a building block for us. And over the coming months, we'll be creating a new party structure for Reform UK with democracy at its very heart. Now, our country, our beloved nation, the British people, we can do this. We can be this ambitious. We can afford this stimulus, this simplification. We really can do it. Now, proper reform, it requires vision, it requires confidence, it requires a can-do, let's get things done attitude. And we at Reform UK, we know that if we do this, our nation will have a much brighter, much happier and much wealthier future. So now that concludes my sort of formal presentation. I'd like to invite some questions from members of the press. And I think first we've got Hugo Guy from iNews. Hugo, good morning. Hi. Hopefully you can hear me.
Good morning, Richard.
Hi.
Yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me too. Couple of questions. First of all, obviously in the short term, the biggest challenge facing the economy is COVID-19 and the recovery from COVID-19. When Reform UK was relaunched last year, you said that the big focus, at least to start with, was going to be on opposing lockdowns and encouraging the fastest possible return to normality. You haven't mentioned that today. Is that still a priority? And are you going to push for the quickest possible reopening? And do you have a position on the idea that some limited interventions may be required over the longer term, such as the wearing of masks in public and local lockdowns in the event of flare-ups? And then very quickly, can you say roughly how many candidates you're expecting to stand at the local elections?
Sure, yes. So when we announced our rebrand, our rename as Reform UK, we said very clearly we supported the Great Barrington Declaration, but the government made it very clear that we weren't even literally allowed to talk about it. The number of times I was prevented on the media from even discussing it is just not allowed. And yes, I think the government has been too slow on easing the lockdown, but the government is set in its course. It's clearly not going to budge. And as I said at the beginning, actually, the most productive thing is, yes, I'd like restrictions to be eased earlier. No question about that. But I think we've got to look forwards and we've got to say, right, what next? How do we dig ourselves out of this hole faster to the benefit of the whole nation? That's the right thing to do. And in terms of ongoing restrictions, let me be very clear. We at Reform UK, we commit 110% that all the liberties that have been taken away by this authoritarian government, all of them, every single one, must be given back to the people. And no, I think that we will learn in time the mental health issues, the damage, the collateral damage from lockdown, which, by the way, it's quite clear from the evidence, lockdowns don't prevent mortalities. But the mental health damage, children going back to school today, I know, I've heard it this morning, last night, the anxiety, the fear, the worry. When you've got children worrying, 6-year-old kids worrying about dad going out of the house in the morning because it's a scary world out there. This is the damage that this government has done to our children. And never again should we lock down like this. Never again should we. I don't believe children should be wearing masks in school. I think it's totally unnecessary. And, I applaud those children and parents who've got the courage, and it requires courage, to say actually no. Because, they're worried. The mental health anxiety that this is causing, I think, is huge and deeply damaging to young people's confidence. So hopefully that answers your questions, Hugo. And as I say, we commit to returning all of liberties back to the people. Secondly, we've got Martin Brown from the Daily Express, I think. Martin, good morning to you.
Morning, Richard. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Good, good. Just a couple of questions. One, Nigel Farage has cast a huge shadow on British politics for a number of years now. Do you think it's important that you and Reform UK emerge from that shadow, and how are you planning to achieve that? And also, Lawrence Fox is standing for the London mayoral elections. Your parties share some similar issues. Will you be backing him, or will you be fielding your own candidate? And could I get a quick word on where you stand on Scottish independence as well, please?
Yeah, sure. Let's be very clear. Nigel hasn't cast a shadow over British politics. He has shone a beacon of light and hope, and has succeeded in being probably the most influential politician of the last half century, apart from one or two other key people. So, he's achieved a huge amount, and we hope to continue that. Sorry, the second part of your question, in terms of, yes, we will be fielding candidates across the whole country, hundreds of candidates in London, in Wales, in Scotland, certain mayoral elections, local elections. What's interesting is actually lots of people have been a bit anxious about standing because of COVID. It's inferred that we can't canvass, we can't campaign, can't leaflet, all these difficult issues. I think it is important the elections do go ahead everywhere. And yes, we'll be having hundreds of candidates. And you talked about Lawrence Fox. Yes, Lawrence, he's standing as Mayor of London, very much on a slogan of reopening, rebuilding, reclaiming our freedoms. And that is absolutely crucial. I wish him well in standing as Mayor. And yes, we're going to be having candidates for the London Assembly, as I say, as well as Wales and Scotland. Did that answer all your questions, Martin? Or was...
And just on the issue of the Union and Scottish independence.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we're very clear. We gave a press conference a while back on the Union of Scotland. It's absolutely clear to me that the Union is central. All of us have grown up with the Union. We are one big family. And the reality is, our predecessors, they have fought and died together as a union. We've invested together as a nation, as a people, as a big family, as a union. And actually, let's be very clear. These extremists, these separatists that want to blow up probably one of the most successful union of nations, they're actually a very small number of people. But that would so dramatically affect all 67 million citizens of the UK. There's no question that the sum of the whole of the four nations of the UK is much, much greater than the sum of the parts. And if Scotland was independent, think of a human body. It would be like chopping the leg off the body of the Union. It would be damaging to Scotland, and it would be very painful for the rest of the United Kingdom. And I believe, truly, that actually that would be so damaging. It's a decision for the whole of the United Kingdom. I said it before, and I'll say it again. The idea that a militarily weak and financially challenged independent Scotland on our borders, I don't think that is an acceptable risk that we, the other 62 million citizens, should contemplate. Because the fear would be that Scotland, in that situation, they might be tempted with cheap finance and cheap technology from a less than friendly state. That is not a risk that this country, 67 million citizens of the UK, should ever contemplate. It's a decision for the whole of the United Kingdom. It's not something that a small band of extremists who want to try and blow up the United Kingdom should be allowed to get away with. So I hope that's pretty crystal clear for you, Martin.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, then I think we've got a question from a supporter, Gary, in Wales.
Hello, Richard.
Hi, Gary.
Congratulations on becoming the new party leader of the Reform UK. A good morning on a glorious day here in Treorchy in the Rhondda Valley, South Wales. My question is, the plan sounds very interesting.
Good, that's a good start.
But will it stimulate enough, or will it stimulate economic growth enough?
Look, it's a great question, Gary. And certainly the international evidence. I talked about Australia. Australia takes their total tax take is about 27, 28%, and they're growing much faster than the UK, with our tax take in the low 30s. So the evidence is there internationally. Singapore, their tax take is less than 20%. If we become a low tax economy, then yes, it will stimulate much higher growth. We believe around 1.25%. Time would tell. It might be a bit more, it might be a bit less. But one thing is for sure, we have to try it. We have to go for it. If we don't, we know the consequences. The consequences, the evidence is there. In the last 20 years, our growth has declined to a frankly woeful level. Tax has gone up, regulation has gone up, and they are all interlinked. So the evidence is clear from international examples, and we need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to put the foot flat on the accelerator, Gary.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
So I think in conclusion, our plans are bold, they are ambitious, and they set us well apart from the other parties. We're giving voters a real choice, a real alternative to vote for. And we can make proper reform a reality. And if we do this, as I said, our great nation will have a much brighter, much happier, and much wealthier future. Thank you very much indeed.